This is the time in our service when we invite people to share what is in their hearts. Whether it's a great joy or a deep sorrow, it's not a time for announcements or political statements. If you wish, please come forward to light a candle and tell us your name, if you like, and share your joy or sorrow if you choose to do so. Please hold the mic straight in front of you, parallel to the floor, so that people can hear you and so that we can broadcast to those who are listening on YouTube.
My name is Randa. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I have a candle of appreciation and a little story, very short. Every Martin Luther King birthday, Monday, Doreen and Carl Spirito used to invite me to the Martin Luther King breakfast. And one year, about 10 years ago, it was in Kennebunk, and Doreen was saying, at the time, our church did not have a social justice committee, and Doreen said, we've got to get a social justice committee because it's very motivating to go to those breakfasts. And so we came back and started Faith in Action, which has evolved to the Ministry of Faith in Action, and it has been very inspirational and guiding for me, and I'm very proud that our church has a vision for our place in the world.
Good morning. I'm Ann, and I'm following hot on Randa. We did not confer about this, but we don't make a big deal of Martin Luther King Day in this church anymore. But I'm old enough to remember marching. I'm old enough to remember the stories, and I'm hoping and praying for us to remember in the months to come Martin Luther King's message of nonviolent protest.
I'm Lori, and I have a joy to share that my daughter is 8 days free from vaping. So anyone who's ever tried to quit can know that that's just incredible. And her wisdom teeth decided to start coming in on Friday, and she's in incredible pain. So she's like, let me just vape, it'll make me feel better. No. And just wanted to put an invitation out to anybody who might want to send a card. My mother's 90th birthday is coming up, and when she was talking about, oh, I don't really have friends or relatives to invite besides my sister and I, because she's 90 and everyone's dead. So my sister and I were like, you know what? We could just inundate her with cards. So if anybody wants to send her a card, let me know. Or give one to me, because I'm going to go there on the February 12th and wish her happy birthday.
I lit one final candle for all the joys and sorrows that remain unspoken. And please take a moment to hold what's been shared in your heart.
Please join me in the spirit of prayer. Spirit of life and love, Holy One of our being and our becoming, that which is sacred within, among, and beyond us, We know so many stories about you: God, Lord, King, Father, Earth Mother, Great Spirit, Universe, Holy Parent, Divine Love, Deepest Longings, Covenanted Partner. We know stories about our country and its founding, too, of the values we claim as a people. We have stories about those narratives, about how our values have and have not manifested in our reality. Blessed One, we also know so many stories about ourselves, some of them the same stories we tell about others. Beautiful, ugly, simple, difficult, joyous, useful, worthless. Stories about who we are, what we know, and the potentials and impossibilities of our future. Stories about our purpose and the meaning of our lives. We have countless stories buried too deep in our souls for us to even recognize them. God of discovery, help us find the strength to excavate those buried stories. Let us lean on one another as we brush them off, hold them up to the light, and find their meaning and use. May our roots nourish us so that we might grow abundantly and flower into blessings for one another and the world. Above all, Holy Parent, sing us a gentle lullaby in the trees and the wind, in the kind words of our neighbors, in the warmth of the sun and the sparkle of the snow. Whisper to us the truest story you know, and sing it to us in notes we can never unhear. Remind us every day, every moment, that we are beloved, beloved, beloved. Spirit of life. Yeah. Spirit of life. Okay.
Join me in singing Spirit of Life.
This morning's reading is by Reverend Bob Janice Dillon, called Today is an Adventure. Today is an adventure. Each day is an adventure. It begins with the earth turning to reveal the sun, a ball of flame almost 1,000,000 miles across that we have known throughout our lives and the lives of every earth creature who has ever lived. The adventure of the day begins with the blood of life flowing through our arteries and capillaries. with the breath of life connecting us with the trees in mutual wonder and uplifting joy. And the day progresses through sorrows and disappointments, snatches of good luck, with 5-year conversations continued with old friends, and a new hello to the fellow traveler on the sidewalk. Do we not travel through time and space and through the electric galaxy of emotions swirling in the space of our minds? Is this not a desperately exciting opportunity for the world to happen and us to care about it? Is not this whole story, is not every blink of our eyes a miracle?
And please stand and join us in hymn number 34, Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire. Well, this reflection has been through a couple of iterations, actually, yeah, 3. It's Lori and I chuckle about how hard it is to come up with a title for a sermon, sometimes 3 months in advance, because we do meet quarterly. We have a retreat quarterly to plan, but then. I had a couple of other ideas, but it turned out that what I was planning to preach about today was quite similar to what Lori had already preached about. So this is going to be a little different than I'd planned, and it's based on a TED Talk given by a novelist whose name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and Reverend Gretchen Haley wrote a lot of this reflection, so I thank her for her inspiration and for her words. So, the commander of a vessel that was engaged in maneuvers in heavy weather was on the bridge one night when the watch noted that there was another vessel directly ahead of them some distance away. The commander ordered the appropriate person to contact the vessel and to order them to turn so that they would pass to starboard. There was an immediate response saying, "We suggest you turn immediately to port." The commander knew the formation of the group of ships with him, even though he couldn't see them, and he responded with a sharp command for the vessel ahead of them now closer to pass to starboard. The vessel responded, "Turn immediately to port." The commander, knowing he couldn't turn to port because there was another ship out there, pulled rank and informed the rogue vessel that this was Commander Jones on the USS Tweedledum on maneuvers, and he expected the ship to get out of his way now. The reply came back, "This is a North Ipswich lighthouse, sir. I suggest you turn immediately to port." So this story today is about the danger of having one story in your head. So she begins, "As my family and I have settled into Fort Collins over these past few months, we've begun to develop a few reliable routines, none more critical than the daily ritual of my children pulling all of their stuff from their backpacks when they get home from school. One day last week, my son was in the midst of this daily routine when he brought me a green piece of paper for a project his class would be doing for Thanksgiving. Our class is learning about the Pilgrims, it said, and the story of America. To help us explore this story, please talk about these questions with your child." Okay. It went on, "At some point, your family came to America. Please note when they arrived, where they came from, and what the family name was." And then it had 2 lines. "My mother's family name was blank. Her family came to America from blank in the year blank." And it went on that way with the father's name. After reading, she says, I paused, took a deep breath, and turned to my curious 6-year-old. "Wow," I said, "this assignment is kind of challenging." Between my pause and breath and my measured response, a flood of less measured thoughts raced through my mind. Mother and father, like everyone, has precisely one of each? And what's up with this mixing up of parents generally with biological parents? Was this actually an exercise on ancestry? Doesn't say that. And what does she mean, the story of America? Does she really think the U.S. only contains those whose ancestors traveled here from somewhere else? I thought about my friends, a 2-mom family that includes a Native American adopted daughter. I wondered how to teach her imagine that they would fill out the form. I'm guessing that she didn't imagine it. In her story of America, as that story is represented at an elementary school, in Fort Collins, Colorado, my friends aren't there, in some degree, neither were we. Author Chimamanda Adichie tells the story of growing up in Nigeria as an avid and early reader, mostly of British and American children's books. By the time she was 7, this early reading turned into early writing, as she began to craft her first stories in pencil with crayon illustrations. And she mentions this in her TED Talk. She says, "All of her early characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked about the weather and how lovely it was that the sun had come out." This, she said, despite the fact that she lived in Nigeria where it never snowed. They ate mangoes and never talked about the weather because there was no need to, unlike us. Adichie says her limited reading exposure created in her this limited idea about what literature meant, making her believe that a real story had nothing to do with her everyday experience. Only once she learned about and started reading African writers did she have the big aha moment that inspired her to weave together the fantasy fun of her early reading with her real-life experiences. And she is a novelist. Adichie is a novelist, and I intend to check her work out. Very, very curious about it. It reminds me of how I spent my whole life deeply connected to spirituality and faith. Even preached the homilies at both my confirmation mass and my high school baccalaureate. But I never imagined myself in religious leadership until I experienced my own female minister. The priests of my childhood had created in me this limiting story of what ministers looked like, what they knew, what they talked about, what they cared about, which is to say, they didn't wear skirts. They weren't feminists, they weren't moms, they didn't study performance art or appreciate queer theory or queer anything or anyone, and definitely didn't love pop culture or fashion as much as I did, and I do. But then suddenly I discovered a new story in my female skirt-wearing feminist minister, and it was like, why didn't I think of this before? Adichie calls this the danger of the single story. Growing up in her single story was the literal stories of British and American children's literature. Later, when she came to the US for college, she experienced the single story that many Americans have about Africa. For example, her roommate asked if she could listen to some of her tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when Adichie produced a tape of Mariah Carey. She says, my roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe where there were no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. Whether or not they arise as or out of single stories, each of us walks around with a number of stories we use, consciously or subconsciously, to help us understand and navigate the world and our place in it. These arrive out of our earliest years and our family systems and our accumulated life experiences. In our communities, we hold shared stories, narratives about how things work, origin stories, recovery stories, stories of being broken apart and lost, sometimes forever, stories of love and connection and discovery. Families have stories, stories we tell and retell about each other. And congregations have stories too. We have stories that help us to know who we are, how we relate to each other, and what we mean to each other and why. Of all the ways we might think of as what binds people in relationship, we don't name it too often, but shared stories may be one of the most important. Stories can keep us stuck. Stories can keep us stuck, and I know they have with me, in a perpetual cycle of struggle, or they can liberate us into a previously unimagined potential. When we're open to the presence of more than one story, we can choose which of these stories we want to live our lives out of and in response to. Adichie doesn't say whether their encounter expanded her roommate's understanding of Africa. If she was as deeply committed to her single story as the naval commander, even if she was receiving alternative information, she may have been unwilling or unable to hear it, possibly. Stories are one of the main factors in what psychologists call our perpetual perceptual set. Unitarian spiritual director Andrea Anastas describes it as the way that we select what we see or hear based on our preconceptions or expectations, and we interpret what we see or hear based on formative past experiences. These stories that we've been told that we tell about ourselves and the world around us. Like the commander who was so sure of the story he was in, so sure of what was happening and what part he was playing in it, that he saw only evidence to support his theory. He interpreted everything around him based on the story he thought he was in. His perceptual set prevented him from seeing what was actually happening. Some forms, she says, are totally benign. Tailors who notice the cut of a suit before they notice the person wearing it. Gardeners who notice the garden before they notice the house. But we have also seen tragic examples of this perceptual set. The conversation around the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, for example, is filled with the impact of people's perceptual set, the impact of the story any of us has internalized about white people and about black people, about race at all, about black teenagers or any teenagers, about police officers or guns, about Missouri, about America. Any and all of those will change how we see and interpret the situation in Ferguson, how we understand it as relating to us and our lives, if and how we care or respond. And all of these will impact how we understand the story that played out that night in early August. The story of a police officer was playing out. The story of Michael Brown thought he was in, the story we still see unfolding in response. How committed are we to a single story as we encounter Ferguson and other complex situations like Ferguson? How willing are we to open ourselves to multiple stories? That will determine just how possible reconciliation and liberation and a deeper humanity will be for all of us. The consequences of a deeply held perceptual set play out all the time at a global, society, and also completely personal level. She says, my paternal grandfather walked through most of her later life believing the story that her children had left her behind and their spouses kept them from her and her friends neglected her. After all she had done for them, it stung bitterly. My grandmother was very committed to this single story, one that narrative therapists would call a problem-saturated story. In response to this commitment, my grandma's adult children who were living full lives, raising their own kids, were stung by her coldness towards them and to their spouses. Her friends were confused by her sharp criticisms, and eventually, whether or not my grandmother's single story was originally true, its consequences were often fulfilled. She was lonely and isolated, and her children and their spouses and her friends all pulled away in response to her withdrawn defensiveness. Problem-saturated stories are often self-fulfilling. Believing the problem story, you act out your version of the truth. Others respond to you in kind, which in turn provides evidence that you were right all along. And so you double down and repeat the cycle. The more people who interact with a problem-saturated story, the harder it is to escape its grip, especially in the times of change. Church consultant and UU minister Larry Piers notes that you can recognize the problem-saturated story when you're in a group where someone offers an example of how difficult or awful something is. Before you know it, the rest of us can't help but chime in with more evidence for how truly bad and impossible the situation is. We can almost hear ourselves saying, even if the words aren't verbalized, "You think that's bad? Let me tell you, it's even worse than you realize." When we hear ourselves stuck in such moments, whether in our church or in our lives, we can help each other remember that although there are many things true about the story we're sharing, the way we're telling it has been created, as Piers says, by a particular sifting of the facts. And there are other ways to tell the story, indeed entirely other stories available for us to live out and create. We can ask how others would tell the story, what outside observers might say, or even what would someone who disagrees with our version of events say about this situation. All of these and similar questions allow us to shake loose from the grip of the problem-saturated single story and instead release ourselves into the alternative, equally true stories that are present at all times. The stories that allow us to live into our potential and our goodness rather than into our problems. UU congregations intentionally seek to cultivate multiple stories. As we welcome the Buddhist chant alongside the Shaker traditional song, alongside the Christian hymn, alongside the contemporary Unitarian Universalist song of gratitude. And we give thanks for each of these melodies and tones and the ways they enrich the others by coming together. Our faith values multiple ways of understanding and naming truth and meaning. And we value the struggle to name anything for sure. That sound familiar? The posture of humility such questioning entails. We respect and rejoice in all the ways we each encounter and claim life in its most ultimate sense. We're also a place that holds many different stories about our congregation. Often we tend to believe whatever experience or understanding we have of our church, we assume that it's the same for every other church member, but in truth, our various arrival times and friendships mean there are many different threads, different stories present here all the time. But then again, it's also totally different than folks like Jean Horton, who remember multiple ministers before Lori, as well as other buildings before this one. And Ann Dobson would tell you that Unitarianism was totally different then than it is today. And it'll be totally different than the experience of those who arrive here in 5, 10, 15, 50 years from now. It's kind of fun to imagine that, isn't it? Sometimes we get confused and assert that this intentionally multivocal storytelling translates to anything goes. But this is not the case. In order to do anything of meaning, we must ultimately bring together our many stories into a shared, larger story, the story of the UUCSB. Although we are invited to sing the song that speaks to our hearts, we still have to choose from among the songs that fit together for our community to work. Our songs must find a similar key, a complementary rhythm, and must work with each other to make something beautiful together. We bring our many stories and we listen well, and we open our hearts to multiple understandings, and yet ultimately we must seed some of our individual stories in service of a greater calling. The greater story refuses to perpetuate the problem-saturated stories and instead feeds the larger story of hope. The story of people who are kind to one another, who assume the best in each other, who listen and love each other across our differences, who make room for the variety of stories that are present in the human family, and welcome all who welcome all. I love that line, welcome all who welcome all. People who are open and willing and curious, the story of refusing to imagine one another as an enemy, people who listen and learn together, who speak the truth in love, who mess up, who forgive each other, and it's okay. People who laugh and risk showing up for each other even when it's hard, and sometimes it's hard. People who want to make a real difference in the world. Our faith is the story of what Victoria Safford describes as the beautiful, proud history of work for human rights and freedom, for social change and peace and protection of this earth. The story of those who lived their lives and gave their lives for love, for a different and truly patriotic ideal of liberty and justice for all. And our many stories come together. We give thanks, for this is our shared song. Let us lift our voices and sing out in love. Amen. And I'd like to invite you now into a time of meditation. I invite you to take a couple of deep breaths with me. And sit as comfortably as you can, and your feet on the floor if your feet reach the floor. And I'd like to start with a few words, and then let's take about 5 minutes of just silence. I'll ring the chime at the end. Who dreamed you into being? What stories sat in their heart as they imagined what you would become? Who helped you imagine your story? Who helped you see your place in the story of the world? And what maybe matters the most, who helped you understand that you could be the author of your own unfolding? All of which is a way of asking, who listened? Who listened until you could hear yourself speak, until you trusted the voice that is your own? Now, this is the time in our service where we share our monetary gifts, the work of this church. As always, half of our plate will be sent out into the wider world, This goes to My Place Teen Center this month. So if you're watching from home, checks can be mailed to 60 School Street, Saco, Maine, 04072, or you can click on the what is it, Trevor? It's a button on the, oh, okay. So gifts can be given that way too. All right. So please be generous as the ushers wait on you. And please join me in the words to extinguish the chalice. As we release this flame from its faithful service today, we allow the spark in each of us to burn on, to warm our compassion, to fire our delight, to light our paths today, tomorrow, and always. We're running over a little bit on time, but I don't think we could have a service on Martin Luther King's birthday without singing "We Shall Overcome." So please join me. May the stories we tell name the largest truths of what was, of what is, and pull us forward to what should be, as stories were always meant to. Our service is now concluded. Big thank you to Tom today, and a huge vote of thanks to Trevor, too. Please stay seated for the postlude. Thanks.